Hey y'all, this is take 2 of lesson 1, Beekeeping 101, Honeybee Society, Honeybee Biology. Thank y'all so much for joining me. Thank you for the patience. We had a little bit of technical difficulties there at the beginning. I actually ran through and gave the whole lesson, and Facebook didn't record a single minute of it. So we're back to do it again. Like I said, really appreciate y'all's patience. I'm excited to go through this topic with y'all. I hope that y'all find it as interesting as I do. But a little bit of stuff off the top. If you have questions during this course, please drop them in the comment section. Unfortunately, because I'm doing screen sharing with this video, I won't be able to see them as they come in, but I will come back and I will answer your questions after the video is over. So as questions come to mind, jot them down in the comment section. Don't leave them till later, because if you're like me, we're going to forget them. So make sure to drop your comments in the comment section below. We're going to talk about 3 things in this lesson. First of all, the 3 kinds of bees that make up a hive. We're going to look at what's in a hive and how it works. We're also going to look at the 3 major bee breeds, the kind of what you've got to choose from in the supermarket of honeybee breeds. So starting right out at the very top of the totem pole, let's look at the queen. In a hive, you have the queen, you have worker bees, and you've got drone bees. The queen is at the top because, in my opinion, she's got the most important role. She lays all the fertile eggs. Now, she can lay 300 to up to 3,000 eggs a day, depending on the circumstances. Now, I say depending on the circumstances because in the spring, when they're ramping up, she's not going to be laying a ton. She's only laying enough to get the population growing at a reasonable rate and get them started. But when they're in summer, in full swing, she can be cranking out 3,000 eggs a day. And that's what attributes, and that's what makes the explosive hive growth that starts the swarming cycle, which we'll talk about that later. There's only one queen in a hive, and that's actually been something I've seen some interesting research on. If you want to get into a higher level of beekeeping, there's this really fascinating system called the 2-queen system, where they take one beehive and put 2 queens in it, separated by a queen excluder, and those 2 queens, create this massive super hive, which is like a super organism, and it makes this massive amount of honey. It's really cool. It's really cool, but it is way beyond the scope of this lesson. So we'll just leave it at that. The way that the queen is born is also a really cool story. A little morbid, but bear with me. So say the old queen dies, or say that they're going to swarm. In order to get a new queen, the worker bees will select about 10 to 12 eggs, and they'll feed them a special diet that's usually, as far as we know, it's exclusively royal jelly. Now, whether or not that makes the queen, research does not agree. There's actually some information out there, research that suggests that it's actually the absence of bee bread that makes her a queen. So definitely a topic for further research there if that interests you. But anyways, she's fed a special diet. They make a very special cell for her, which is longer and larger to give her the room she needs to become this big, beautiful golden queen. And when she matures and she's ready to hatch out, this coup occurs where the first queen to make it out of the cell will race to her sister's cells. Remember, there's other queen cells too that they've started. She'll race to those cells and sting her sisters to death through the cell wall. Now, say one of her sisters makes it out before she gets there, they will duel and fight to the death, and whichever one wins becomes the reigning queen. So, kind of cool, kind of morbid, kind of depends on what your interests are there. But that's how the queen is selected. She has to fight and basically be the last girl standing. After she has fought and won the throne, she goes out on her once-in-a-lifetime mating flight. She only mates once, and it's at the beginning of her life cycle. And she'll mate with a couple hundred drones, hopefully. And I say hopefully because you can have a queen who is not well mated. and she does not perform as well as a queen who was mated well. But again, that's a topic that's kind of out of the scope of this course. We can talk about it later. All you need to know is that she goes on her mating flight, mates with drones, and then she comes back to the hive to begin her reign as queen. So that's the queen bee in a nutshell. She's the foundation of the hive in that she's laying all the fertile eggs. And when you're checking your hive, we'll talk about this in lesson 2. We'll go through what a hive checkup looks like. One of the things you're looking for is the queen. And a lot of times you won't find her because she's actually pretty elusive. I mean, she sticks out like a sore thumb in this photo, but when you're looking through 80,000, that many bees, it's like finding a needle in a haystack. So a lot of times you'll just look for the eggs. And the eggs might look like this little speck right in there, little grains of rice down in the bottom of the cell. They're kind of hard to spot, but there's a lot more of them, so it's easier to tell that there's a queen by looking for eggs than by trying to find the queen herself. So that's a bunny trail. Let's talk about the worker bee. This girl is the workhorse behind the rest of what goes on in the hive. And I got to give credit for this graphic. I like this graphic a lot. It's from Livingstone Graphics. It can be a little confusing. So I want you to only pay attention to the y-axis here, not the x-axis for now. Let's just talk about the y-axis. So when this worker bee starts out, she starts as an egg. After 3 days, she turns into a larva. All this time, she's being fed royal jelly and bee bread, and she's maturing. At 9 days, the cell, the little wax cell that she lives in, is capped over by other worker bees, and that just means it has a lid put on it, so that way she can build her cocoon and pupate. And what happens then is kind of similar to what we see happening with a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. She builds a cocoon, metamorphosis occurs, or pupation in this case, and when she emerges, chews out of that wax cell at 21 days, she's a worker bee. And what happens next is cool. She kind of graduates through this series of tasks. And the first series of tasks that she goes and does is really mainly nurse work. She's feeding the young queen. She's feeding the young larva. She's cleaning and eating pollen. She's doing basically housework and caring for young. After 42 days, she graduates and becomes a field bee. And that's when her tasks change. That's when she leaves the hive and begins taking orientation flights. And this is something that you can actually watch happen. If you're standing in front of your hive and you're watching the bees go in and out, you might notice one come out and she just starts going in circles. And the circles get a little wider and wider and wider until you can't see her anymore. What she's doing is she's mapping the local area. She's learning the terrain. And the neat part about this is that studies have shown that bees know their terrain almost up to a 5-mile radius. The way they did this was cool. They took bees and brought them certain distances from the hive and released them to see if they could make it back to the hive. And the hypothesis being that if they could make it back to the hive, they understood the area well enough at that distance to be able to navigate and make it home. So bees made it home up to 5 miles away from their hive. Isn't that crazy? So that bee knows all the area within a 5-mile radius of her hive. And that's the area that she uses for foraging. So that's the other part of her work. She forages for nectar, pollen, propolis, water. When she's back at the hive, she's guarding, she's making wax, she's building comb, she's fanning her wings to run air over the nectar and make it honey. The tasks are specific to the age of the bee. In the summer, this lifespan that we see of 63 days isn't necessarily accurate. In the summer, she works so hard that her wings tatter and she dies. Like, she works herself to death. And you can see this sometimes too in the front of the hive. You'll see bees that just look ragged, just stumbling around in front of the hive. And that can be because of pesticides, or if they're really ragged, it's probably because they've just worked themselves to death. So It's kind of a sobering lesson in just the self-sacrifice behind a relentless work ethic, or even workaholicism. You can work your wings off if you're not careful. But it's also just an incredible testament to the work that these girls go through to make sure that the rest of their hive is taken care of. So, really neat character lesson, I think, there. Another thing that we pull from bees is their self-sacrifice and stinging. You probably already know that once a bee stings you, she dies. If you didn't know that, fun fact, a bee can only sting you once. A honeybee can only sting you once. And the reason for that is because their stinger has a barb on it that sticks in your flesh, and when she tries to fly away after stinging you, that stinger is actually attached to her reproductive organs, and when she flies away, it pulls her guts out and leaves them with you. That's a nice mental image there. But it's significant because although she can only sting you once for that reason, and she dies afterwards, she can sting other insects multiple times because their exoskeletons, obviously, they aren't the same as our skin or other mammal skin. So that barb doesn't stick in other insects, and she's able to defend the hive against insect intruders better than she is against mammal intruders. It's more costly as far as bee lives go to defend against mammal intruders. So, fun fact. Not that you necessarily needed to know that, but it was kind of always a source of sadness when we got stung after we started beekeeping. First, it was like, ow, we got stung. Oh, you deserved it, you little stinker. But then afterwards, as we grew in beekeeping, both my mom and my brother and I were like, oh, poor girl. So we're looking at her struggling to get away, and her stinger and her guts are all over the place. And it was just, yeah, we cried some tears. You'll get there. Don't worry. But that's the worker. The drone is the population of the hive is made up of about 10% drones. And again, that's dependent on the circumstances, so take that with a grain of salt. But this is what he looks like. He's got the big wraparound eyes, huge eyes. He looks like a barrel. I mean, he looks like a guy. He's big, buff, and got the big lady killer eyes. It's what you want in a guy, right? And you'd think he's also lucky because he only makes up 10% of the hive, so he's got his pick of the girls, right? Not so much. So his life is pretty short and sweet, depending on how you define sweet. But his only purpose is to mate with a virgin queen during her first mating flight. And after he mates, he dies. Yeah, that's it. All he does is eat, mate, and die. If he is fortunate enough to make it through the year without mating with a queen, in the process of getting ready for winter, the rest of the worker bees kick out all the drones because the drones eat so dang much that they can't afford to keep these guys in the hive over the winter because they'll eat them out of house and home. So these worker bees will literally chew the legs and the wings off the drone bees and kick them out the front door. This is another thing that you can witness firsthand if you stand in front of your beehive during the fall and watch them kind of go through their fall cleaning. You'll see them dragging out drone bodies that have been dismembered and mangled, and it's because they're getting out the mouths who aren't working. So another kind of very morbid process, but fascinating at the same time. Drones will really only live a season if they aren't mating with a queen and dying by that time. So fascinating stuff. Let's talk about what's in a hive now. Those were the three types of bees. Let's talk about their house. In a bee house, you have a lot of components. I want to talk about honeycomb, honey, brood, the beeswax itself, which makes up the honeycomb, and propolis. Now, I chose this picture because it was kind of the best one I could find in our archive of what a natural hive looks like. This was a job that my brother Paul and I, that's Paul in the picture, handsome stud, yes, I know. This is a picture of a job that Paul and I did when we were, I think, 15 or 16, something like that. But we were running a swarm removal business, and part of that job, we removed swarms from, or established hives from old barns. This was a beehive that was in somebody's wall. We had to remove the siding and cut out the comb. But it's really neat to see how the bees chose to build their comb in that cavity. So for a little bit of context, let's talk about what we're seeing here. This lighter patch is honey. It is sealed honey. It is capped over honey. That means it's a cell that they've filled up with nectar. They've dehydrated it. It's been brought to the appropriate moisture level, and then they covered it up with a wax lid. So that's the honey. Notice that it's at the top. There's some more over here. There's some over here. Notice that it's at the top of the honeycomb. Further down, this darker stuff, besides the bees, you can kind of see the bees by the glints on their wings. Here you go. This darker stuff is capped over brood. That's baby bees who are pupating right now and getting ready to hatch out. So the structure of this is interesting. There's honey at the top. There's brood. There's a gap. What happened there? Then there's more brood. And then there's this really light colored comb. Let's talk about what's going on there. In a bee's house, the foundation, the honeycomb goes through, it's built in a very specific way, and it's filled out in a very specific way. They always start from the top and work their way down. In the freshest comb, the queen she'll lay eggs, and as that egg develops, it becomes a pupa, then a larva, then it gets capped over and it turns into brood. Then that brood hatches, hence the empty spot here, and then the worker bees, that nurse bee, she'll come by, she'll clean out that cell, and when it's ready, the queen will come back and she'll lay another egg in it. Then that egg matures and becomes brood, which we see up here again, and it goes through another cycle of hosting the life of a baby bee. That's what's happening as this comb is being built down. The queen is laying her eggs at the very bottom. They build more comb onto it, and as that egg matures, it becomes brood, and that's why you see kind of this whole patch right here is brood, because the queen laid it in a, for lack of a better word, a layer. She's laying things in a sequence going from the top down. Then there's this bald patch here where the brood is already hatched out. She probably has another round of eggs there. And then you see the brood starting again here, and then at the very top is honey. So the honey is at the top, and it's the last part. It's usually always at the top, because that's where it's easiest to store it, so that way you can get it to these baby bees, because the bees will mix that honey with pollen and they'll ferment it for a little bit and make what we call bee bread, and they feed that bee bread to the baby bees to get them to mature to healthy adults. This is also important because we build our commercial beehives according to their natural tendency to put honey at the top. We have, with a Langstroth hive, at the bottom we have a brood box which holds all the baby bees. Then on top of the brood box we have a smaller box that we call a super, and that holds the honey. Now it makes sense that the super box is on top because bees naturally put their honey on top anyways. So with the help of a queen excluder, they naturally will fill up that super with your honey. And when it comes time to extract, rather than having to go through each frame and cut out the honey here and there, you have a whole box that you can just remove, knock the bees out of, take it into your garage and extract it. So kind of cool how they're so organized that we're able to manage and build according to their tendency to organize their comb in such a way. We're able to build our artificial hives such that we can extract their honey with as little cost to them, the bees, as possible. So way cool on how bees build their home. Let's talk about honey, though. This is also really cool. I got ahead of myself. That's the wrong slide. The honey that we talked about, it's these lighter patches. It takes 200 trips to a flower to make one drop of honey. Is that nuts or what? And that's kind of sobering to think about, like, wow, that much work goes into creating one drop of something we drink in gallons, over the course of a year. So next time you're buying a bottle of honey from Costco, just look at the size of that thing and imagine how many drops in it and how many bees it took to make that one bottle. But that's not all. Once that bee goes out, at one trip, she goes out and she collects nectar from her flower. She sucks it up through her proboscis, which is her little straw that she has as a tongue, into her stomach. And that nectar mixes with her enzymes and the digestive fluids in her stomach, and as she flies back to the hive, she doesn't put it straight in a cell. Get this, she spits it back up and feeds it to one of her sisters. So her sister sucks in that nectar that had all the digestive juices and lovely bee spit in it, puts it into her stomach, and now it's sloshing around in there with her digestive juices. And that's not the end of it either. She probably goes and gives it to one of her sisters, who gives it to one of her sisters, who gives it to one of her sisters, who eventually puts it in the bottom of a cell. So, your honey is actually bee spit. But that's great for us because this honey, this nectar that was pretty much just straight syrup and carbs from a flower, went through the digestive process of this insect and is coming out with a lot of really helpful enzymes, actually, and some antibacterial properties too. It's really fascinating what is really in honey if you dig into it. They put it in the bottom of the cell. It's been regurgitated. It has all this good, lovely bee spit in it. And once that cell is full, they start to fan air over the top of the cell. And this basically dehydrates that nectar, reduces the moisture content to where it becomes honey. At that point, once it's dehydrated enough, they put a wax covering over it, and that's what stores it. That's what keeps it there until they need it again. So that's the down and dirty of where your honey comes from. I hope it's inspiring. Let's talk about the different types of brood. So brood is just where baby bees are kept. But like we talked about at the beginning, there's several different types of bees. There's your queen, your worker, and your drone. So what kind of cell does the queen live in? This cell right here. These ones that look like peanuts. They're longer, allows for more space for her to grow out and become that lovely long queen that we saw earlier. I don't know if you are noticing this, but there's actually a lot of drones in this picture too. See their big wraparound eyes? They look like barrels. These guys here. They have a larger cell as well, but it is not anywhere near as big as these guys. It's important to know what a queen cell looks like because it'll tell you some important things of what's going on in your hive. If you open up your beehive and you see queen cells, you need to note whether they're at the top or the bottom of your comb, of your frames. If they're at the top, that's called a swarm cell. That means that although you already have a queen, your beehive has reached the max capacity that will fit in that box. They're running out of space. So once they've reached that point, they create another queen and they begin the reproduction process called swarming, where their hive will take that new queen who hatches out. And actually the process is that new queen hatches out, she fights her sisters to the death, she stays with the old hive, and the old queen who was previously reigning, she takes half the population and flies away to establish a new colony at some other location. So that's the swarming process. Now, if you see these queen cells at the bottom of your frames, that's indicative of a different scenario. That means that your old queen, for some reason, has passed away. Maybe she got squished during your last check. Maybe she died of natural causes. Maybe they killed her because she wasn't producing well. There's a whole variety of things that can happen, but where the queen cell is placed will generally tell you what's going on. So just know that a queen cell generally looks like this. They can be a little short and stumpy sometimes, but they're always an elongated cell. And if they're at the top of the hive, that's a swarm cell. If they're on the fringe or at the bottom, that's generally a supercedure cell. We call it a supercedure cell because that new queen is going to supersede the old queen. But that's the down and dirty of brood. We already looked at a little earlier what other brood looks like. This is typical worker brood that you're seeing right here. And you'll always see that in your hive, hopefully, if it's a healthy, robust hive. Let's talk about wax. We talked about the honeycomb, but what makes honeycomb? Honeycomb is made up of paraffin that the bee basically extrudes from wax glands in her abdomen. And that's just a fancy way of saying she basically makes wax flakes from her butt, for lack of a better explanation. But what she does is she'll pull these wax flakes out, she'll chew them up with her mandibles, apply some bee saliva as an adhesive, and use them as the building blocks to make those hexagons we're so familiar with in the honeycomb. And it's incredible the kind of engineering strength that we get just from that shape of the hexagon, but also from these tiny little building blocks. I think it's one of the wonders of creation. We take that wax, we'll harvest it, and we use it for candles. It makes excellent candles. Use it in lotions, soaps, you name it. Good stuff. But by far, my favorite component of the hive, I guess actually close competitor with honey, I do love me some good honey, is propolis. What you're seeing in this picture is a beekeeper has opened up his hive. This is the lid. And in the process of opening it, this propolis, or this bee glue, stretched out like toffee and is hanging like stalagmites and stalactites from the tops of the frames and the bottom of the lid. Now, propolis serves a very specific purpose. It's kind of the it's the all-purpose glue that bees use to clog up holes, cracks, to keep out drafts or light or intruders. And they also use it as their sterilizing agent. And this is why it's my favorite. Bees make propolis by going and collecting resins and other botanical oils, like essential oils from plants. They take those elements, they mix them together with wax, and use it to coat the interior of their hive. And the properties of the resins and the oils has really fascinating antimicrobial, antifungal, even anti-cancer properties that, because it's coating the inside of the hive, actually makes the inside of the hive totally sterile. It is an aseptic environment. Isn't that crazy? It's like working inside of a commercial kitchen where everything has to be stainless steel and spotlessly clean. This is a naturally occurring aseptic environment, a naturally occurring sterile environment, just because of this propolis substance. So it's their home defense against pathogens, fungus, viruses, microbes, and it creates it's actually a really incredible, it's got really incredible medicinal properties that we use for ourselves. I was reading today, actually, you can use it to great effect for different gut ailments, irritable bowel syndrome. It helps balance out the negative, the bad microbes in the gut, even in the mouth for bad breath, believe it or not. There's also gynecological uses and topical uses for just an antiseptic for wounds, as well as internal uses. So really neat stuff. I'm looking forward to diving in and making tinctures out of it and just trying it out. But that's propolis in a nutshell. Let's talk about the honeybee breeds. We've talked about the 3 types of bees that are in every single beehive. We've talked about what a beehive is made up of, what the house looks like. Let's talk about the different breeds, because there are different strains. And the number one that I want you to know about, and I want you to start with if you're a beginning beekeeper, is the Italian bee. They're docile and they're easy to work with, and really they are the best of both worlds for honey production and ease of care. The last thing that you want to be worrying about as a new beekeeper is getting chased down and mugged by your bees. And that's why this one is a great bee to start out with. The downside is that it is less resistant to some pests and diseases. We will talk about pests and diseases in the next lesson, and there are ways to help your Italian bees along and help them resist those. But you do need to know that it is going to be a battle with your Italian bees to keep them from succumbing to some of these pests and diseases. That's just the way it's going to be. They do have a fast spring ramp-up time, which can be a positive in that it'll allow for an early harvest of honey. It can also be a negative and that they'll build their population so stinking fast that they outpace the availability of food in nature. So, note here, you will always have to feed your Italian beehives in the spring. It's good management practice to do so to help get them up to speed, but it also prevents them from starving out. You may be like, well, wait, hold up. Why are we feeding this insect who's been surviving in the wild just fine up to this point without any of our intervention? I have to, spoiler alert, Italian bees and honeybees actually are not from here originally. They're not from the States. They're from Europe. We brought them over from Europe in the early 18 or whatever. We used them for making candles in the absence of kerosene when we didn't have electric lighting. That's why we brought them over to the Americas. They also had the additional side benefit, obviously, of honey. Then, as time went on, we began to realize that they make certain European crops doable here in the States, because things like almonds and certain fruits require honeybee pollination almost exclusively in order to fruit. So the reason that they're so popular here and now they're well known and they're kept here is because they're the pollination workhorse is behind almost a third of our commercial crops. So that's why they're here. The reason that we feed them is because our climate is different than Europe. We feed them for that reason, and because it's a good management practice to get them up and running earlier. You got to keep in mind, our mortality rates as beekeepers are probably going to be hovering around 30% every year, average. And we, for that reason, because our mortality rates are so steep, we really want to do everything that we possibly can to get our bees started on the right foot. So that's why I recommend feeding. I'm not opposed to it. I would rather feed them sugar water than have them die and lose that $400 beehive because I wasn't willing to go out and do some work, So something that I've glossed over that I should also explain is feeding. If that doesn't make sense to you, this is what feeding is. We will feed honeybees sugar water and pollen. And in the spring, we feed sugar water to bees at a 1-to-1 ratio. So it makes a light syrup. It's just water, 1 cup sugar, 1 cup water. And that stimulates their wax production. Those glands that we were talking about earlier that secrete the wax flakes, that ratio, that light syrup actually stimulates that production so the bees can build more comb quickly. It's also easier and quicker to digest. It's quick calories, basically, for a beehive that is getting ready to get up and running and they need that extra energy. In the fall, though, and in the winter, we change that ratio to be a 2-to-1 ratio. So it's thicker, there's not as much water in it. And the reason for that is because we want that sugar water to go straight into stores. We want it to be quick and easy for them to dehydrate and put a wax cap on it so that way they can build up their pantry for the winter. Obviously, the lighter honey would take more processing, so that's why we want to have the thicker stuff in the winter so they can more quickly put it into their stores and not have to worry about doing so much work over it. Lastly, pollen. When we feed pollen, we feed it in the form of a pollen patty. You buy pollen in bulk from a beekeeping company like Daydant. I think you can probably find it on Amazon, but it'll come in a big bag like flour. You mix that with sugar water and a little bit of honey to keep it pliable and help it retain some moisture. And it'll be kind of like the consistency of a peanut butter. So you'll take that peanut buttery, gooey mess and you'll slap it in between 2 sheets of wax paper. You'll squish it out, roll it out to where it looks like a pancake in between the wax paper slices, and then you'll slide that patty, that pollen patty, into your hive during the spring and during the fall. Or it's kind of a rescue option too for a hive that's just really struggling. Feeding them pollen is a source of protein that stimulates brood production and helps sustain the new bees as they grow and develop. But the bees will eat through that wax paper. They'll chow down on that pollen patty, and use it as their protein alongside the sugar water that you're already giving them. So that's what we mean when we talk about feeding. That's something you should expect to do, feeding sugar water at least. Pollen patties, they're discretionary. Well, okay, it depends. You should start out, though, expecting to feed sugar water. Don't feel like you have to immediately start out feeding pollen, though. You'll get there. We'll work on that. So, fast spring ramp-up time for the Italian honeybee. Really, to describe them, they're a great bee for beginners and backyard beekeepers. They're docile. They don't generally care if you mow around them. They're great for kids to be around as long as your kids aren't throwing rocks at them or sticking their face in the entrance, or use common sense. Bees will sting if they're attacked, if they're threatened, but Italian bees are by far the best ones to have in your backyard and to work with because they are the hardest to aggravate. Russian bees are kind of not so much. So they're not like Africanized bees where they will mob you and chase you down and try to sting you to death and all the horror stories that we hear. That's not the Russian bee. That's Africanized bees. We're not talking about those guys. But Russian bees are more aggressive. They're a workhorse bee. They are made to keep their hive safe, and they do that by being more aggressive. I only recommend these bees to beekeepers that have 3+ years experience because of that. They are going to be harder to work. They're going to be more flustered and buzzing around and trying to sting you during the checkups, and that's just not something you need to be dealing with in your first years of beekeeping. They do also have a slower ramp-up time during the spring, which can be, like we talked about earlier, you don't have to necessarily worry about feeding them because they are going to ramp up according to the availability of naturally occurring nectar and pollen. So I would still recommend you feed them. It just helps them ramp up faster. But these guys, you don't have to worry about them starving themselves out because their population exploded prematurely like the Italian honeybees. The really neat thing about these guys, and the reason that they're an appealing breed, is because they will work during inclement weather. Cold days, overcast days, rainy days, days when the Italian bees generally lay out. Because of this, they produce more honey than the Italian bees. Additionally, these guys are bred for their resistance to mites and other diseases. That's a big factor when, like we said earlier, our mortality rates are 30%. And really, pests and diseases play a big part of that mortality. So having a resistant bee is really attractive for that reason, and that's why Russian bees are attractive. They overwinter well. They're a tough, no-nonsense worker bee for experienced handlers. The next bee, the carniolan bee, is similar, but has some differentiating factors. Let's look at it. They are more aggressive, but with a little smoke, they calm down pretty well, and they check just about like the Italian bees. So a little easier to work just as long as you're using smoke, which you should be in all your checks anyways. They also have a slower ramp-up time in the spring, just like the Russian bees. They also will work during inclement weather. And the apiary that I buy my bees from, Mountain Sweet Honey in Georgia, they generally see their carniolan bees produce 15% more honey than their Italian bees. And their apiary is made up of 50-50 Italian bees and carniolan bees. However, and this can be a downside if you aren't managing for expanding your apiary, these guys are really prone to swarming, aka they have explosive reproduction. Once that queen gets over that slow ramp-up time and she's cranking out those 3,000 eggs a day, that population skyrockets and they can fill out your boxes in 45 to 60 days, which you could miss that. And once they fill up that box and they hit that limit, there's something that clicks, or even before, it's hard to catch. Something clicks and they decide, okay, we're going to swarm, we're going to reproduce and make another hive. When they swarm and make another hive, that's what they're going to do. You can't really stop them. They're going to leave. And that half of the hive that's leaving, unless you've got a swarm trap out there to catch them, you're going to lose it. So their population gets cut in half, their production workforce gets cut in half, and you lose that production. So that's why it can be a negative. But it can be a positive, because if you are on top of your management and you make sure they have plenty of space, they will fill out an enormous hive and be able to put out the amount of honey that an enormous hive can produce. You can also use that enormous hive to split, and split is just a fancy word that we use in beekeeping to describe artificially reproducing a hive. It's where we take a beehive, cut it in half, add a new queen to the half that doesn't have a queen, and voila, you have two beehives now where you only had one. Because these guys reproduce and hit that explosive growth and thereby swarm, you're able to split them more aggressively than you would other beehives that might be more content to just keep kind of a low-key population, just enough to get the work done, but not enough to really knock it out of the park. These guys are ready to knock it out of the park. Last thing you need to know about carnelian bees is that they go into the winter with a stronger population. The same is true for Russian bees. The caveat with that is that with the larger population in winter, that's more mouths to feed, and you have to have larger winter stores to support that. If you don't have larger winter stores, you risk them starving out in early spring. So, like we talked about with the Italian bees, make sure you're feeding them in the spring. With these guys, probably starting in February, depending on the part of the country that you're in. This will help make sure that they don't start out and that they get a good, strong start. So those are the three popular breeds. To recap the whole lesson, we talked about the three types of bees: the queen, the workers, and the drones that make up a beehive. We talked about the bee's house, the beehive, and how it's built on wax. It's protected by propolis, and it's basically run by women. Italian bees are a great starter bee. Russian and carnelian bees are for honey production and experienced beekeepers. Next week, we're going to cover lesson 2, which is about care and management of your hive. We'll talk about how to start a colony. Where do you begin? We'll talk about what a routine checkup looks like. We'll also look at those pests and diseases that contribute to the mortality in our apiaries. And we'll also look at where to put your hives. Because I know for some of you folks, if you've got multiple things going on, like goats and horses and cows and kids and gardens and everything else, you got to be mindful of where you put your bees. And a lot of folks will ask, well, will my bees bother my horse? Will my bees bother my goats? The answer is they can, so place them accordingly. We'll talk about that next week. But I hope that you enjoyed this lesson. Like I mentioned in the beginning, if you're joining us a little late, if you have any questions whatsoever, drop them in the comments. If you enjoyed this lesson, please like and subscribe and share it with your friends. We'll be able to hopefully get people started on the right foot with these fundamentals. I want to try to keep them as down to earth and simple as possible. I do get pretty excited though and go overboard on all the details, and that's why I'd encourage you to ask questions. Just back me up and say, hey, what about this? What about that? It's totally fine. There's no stupid questions. So that's all I've got for you today. I really appreciate y'all bearing with me. Apologize for the technical difficulties up front. I am looking forward to seeing y'all next week when we talk about hive management. Until then, we will see y'all later.